For a long time we have assumed the button was always what it is now. A humble little fastener, a practical solution to an obvious problem, was invented the moment humans needed to hold their clothing closed. The real story is far stranger and more human than that. For thousands of years, the button existed and was rarely used to fasten anything at all. And when it finally found its true purpose, it quietly rearranged who held power, what people wore, and even how we tell men and women apart. Start with the first problem, which is older than recorded history. People needed to keep their clothing on their bodies. In the cold, in the wind, in the work of daily life, loose cloth had to be gathered and held. For most of human existence, the solutions were simple. People used belts and sashes. They used pins and brooches. They tied, wrapped, and draped. They threaded cords through cloth. The great civilizations of the ancient world, with all their genius, dressed largely in garments that were pinned, belted, and arranged, rather than fastened. The first buttons appeared remarkably early, thousands of years ago, in the ancient Indus Valley and other early cultures. But here is the part that surprises almost everyone. Those early buttons were not fasteners. They were ornaments, small, beautiful objects of shell, bone, or stone, sewn onto clothing purely for decoration. They were sewn on simply to be admired and shown. The button existed for thousands of years as jewelry, as a sign of care and craft, long before anyone thought to make it hold a garment shut. So the unexpected consequence of the button's invention was that, for a very long time, there was no consequence at all. The idea sat quietly in human hands, used and loved but underestimated, waiting for the one missing piece that would unlock everything. That missing piece was almost laughably simple. A small slit in the cloth, the buttonhole. There is a quieter chapter worth pausing on here, because it shows how slowly the right idea can travel. Long before the buttonhole, some cultures had already found ways to make a button do real work, pairing it with a loop of cord rather than a slit in the cloth. A button could be pushed through a fabric loop to hold a cloak or a tunic closed. It worked, after a fashion, but it was fiddly and limited, and it never quite freed clothing to follow the body. The genius of the buttonhole was that it was so plain, a simple reinforced opening in the fabric itself, sitting flush against the cloth, asking nothing extra of the garment. Sometimes the breakthrough is not a grand new device. It is the smallest possible change to something people already had in their hands. That brings us to the second problem, and it is a problem of the body and its shape. For centuries, clothing hung loosely. It was draped and tied, because there was no good way to make it follow the contours of a person closely and comfortably. Loose clothing is forgiving, but it is also shapeless. As the medieval period went on, people increasingly wanted garments that fit, that traced the arms, the chest, the waist, clothing that revealed the human form rather than hiding on it under folds of fabric. The solution arrived in Europe around the 13th century, and it was the marriage of two old ideas into one new one. The decorative button met the functional buttonhole. Suddenly, the button was no longer just an ornament. It was a fastener that could be placed in a tight, precise row, allowing cloth to be drawn snugly and closed firmly along a curve. For the first time, clothing could be tailored to grip the body and still open and close with ease. It was a small mechanical idea with enormous reach. It is worth sitting with how strange that long delay really is. Humanity had the button in hand for thousands of years and used it only to decorate. The pieces were all present. A small fixed object, a cloth that needed closing, and hands clever enough to sew. And yet the simple act of cutting a matching hole took an extraordinarily long time to arrive. It is a gentle reminder that the obvious is often only obvious in hindsight. and that the people of the past were not slow or foolish. They were simply living before an idea that had not yet been thought of. The unexpected consequence of that union reshaped fashion across an entire continent. Garments grew fitted, sleeves clung to the arm, bodices and doublets followed the torso. A whole new human silhouette became possible, and for the first time, the clothing began to truly celebrate the shape of the person inside it. The button had quietly made the tailored garment possible, and in doing so, it changed how people across Europe looked, moved, and presented themselves to the world. That leads us into the third problem, which is not about the body at all. It is about power and the deeply human hunger to show one's place in the world. By the late medieval and early modern period, buttons had become more than fasteners. They had become a canvas for wealth. And here the tailors and craftsmen who made fine clothing stepped to the very center of the story. Because a button could be made of almost anything, it became a perfect way to display status. The wealthy commissioned buttons of gold and silver, of carved ivory, of precious stones, of fine enamel. A single garment might carry dozens of them. And the nobility wore buttons they had no intention of ever fastening. Rows of gleaming buttons running up a sleeve or down a coat were a pure declaration. They said, without a word, I can afford this. I am someone of consequence. The number and the splendor of a person's buttons became a visible measure of their rank. This grew so pronounced that, in some places and times, laws were written to control it. These were the sumptuary laws, rules that dictated who was permitted to wear what. They sometimes reached down to the very buttons on a person's coat, reserving certain materials and certain displays for the upper classes alone. The button, once a simple ornament of shell and bone, had become something a kingdom felt the need to regulate. The craftsmen who designed and made these tiny works of art were valued specialists, and their finest pieces were treasured like jewelry, because in truth, that is exactly what they were. The button found another kind of power, too, on the bodies of soldiers. As armies grew more organized through the 17th and 18th centuries, the buttons on a uniform became a language of their own. Their material, their pattern, the badges stamped upon them, all told you a soldier's regiment and rank at a glance. A row of polished brass buttons turned a coat into a uniform, and a uniform into a sign of belonging to something larger than oneself. For the men who wore them, those small metal discs carried pride, identity, and the weight of the group they served. Even here, the button was doing what it had always done. It was telling the world who a person was. If the quiet histories of these everyday objects stay with you the way they stay with us, you might enjoy following along as we keep uncovering them. One ordinary thing at a time. By the 18th century, the button had reached an astonishing peak of artistry. This was the golden age of the decorative button, especially in France and England. Buttons were painted with miniature scenes, set with gems, crafted from porcelain and precious metal. A gentleman of fashion might wear a coat whose buttons were small masterpieces, each one a tiny portrait or landscape. For a time, the button was one of the most expressive pieces of personal art a person could carry. The makers of these buttons were artists in the fullest sense, and their work was collected and admired. Then the world changed, and the button changed with it. In the late 18th and through the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution arrived, and it transformed the button as completely as it transformed everything else. Machines could now stamp out buttons by the thousands, in metal, in bone, and later in new materials, at a fraction of the old cost. The button stopped being a luxury for the few, and became something nearly everyone could own. The precious handcrafted button did not vanish, but beside it grew an ocean of cheap, sturdy, practical buttons for ordinary clothing and ordinary people. The unexpected consequence of that flood was a kind of democratization. The fitted, fastened, button-up garment, once a privilege of those who could afford fine tailoring, became available across society. The everyday shirt, the worker's coat, the simple dress, all closed with buttons that almost any family could afford. Something that had once marked you as wealthy, now simply marked you as clothed. The button had completed a long journey from rare ornament to symbol of power, to the most ordinary fastener in the world. There is one last consequence of the button's story, and it is one we still live with every single day, often without noticing. If you have ever wondered why men's and women's shirts fasten on opposite sides, the answer lies buried in this history. The most widely repeated explanation reaches back to the era when buttons were a mark of wealth. Well-off men typically dressed themselves, and most people are right-handed, so men's buttons were placed to suit a right-handed person, each button placed across. Wealthy women, by contrast, were often dressed by a servant standing in front of them, so their buttons were placed on the opposite side to suit the helper's hand. Whether or not that explanation is the whole truth, and historians do debate it, the strange custom it describes is undeniably real. To this day, the buttons on a typical men's shirt and a typical women's shirt sit on opposite sides, a small frozen echo of a world of servants and finery that has otherwise long since passed away. A tiny detail, repeated billions of times across the modern world, carrying a fingerprint of the past that most people will never notice. That is the quiet wonder of the button. We pass it a dozen times a day. We fasten it without a single thought, in the morning rush, in the cold, half asleep and barely awake. And in that thoughtless little motion, we are touching one of the most surprising objects humanity ever made. An ornament that patiently waited thousands of years to finally become useful. A fastener that reshaped the human silhouette. A scrap of metal or shell that once declared a person's rank to the entire world. And when you look closely at why the button matters, you find the same thing you find behind so many small inventions. People. The Indus Valley craftsman who patiently carved beauty into a tiny disk of shell. The medieval tailor who first matched a button to a buttonhole and made clothing embrace the body. The artisan who painted a miniature world onto a coat fastening. The factory worker, generations later, who made buttons cheap enough that everyone could finally be clothed with dignity. The button is not really about holding the cloth together. It is about the deep human longing to be seen, to belong somewhere, to show who we are and what we value, and to move through the world held together in every sense of those words. It began its long life as a thing of pure beauty, with no use at all, and perhaps that is the most human thing about it. Long before we asked the button to be useful, we simply wanted it to be lovely. The usefulness came later. The simple wanting came first.